Welcome, advocates, to another episode of the Lead in Equity podcast, a podcast that focuses on supporting educators with the tools and resources necessary to ensure equity at their schools. Today's special guest is Dr. Reshma Ramkellawan and Dr. Jacobē Bell. So without further ado, Resmaa and Jacoby, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you so much for having us. We're so glad to be here.
The pleasure is all mine. Thank you so much. I am excited because you're the authors of Reclaiming Authenticity, Unearth Your True Self, and Build an Equitable Classroom. And folks, there's a link in the show notes, so make sure that you grab yourself a copy. I want to start with you, Resmaa. Why don't you share a little bit about yourself and what you currently do?
Yeah, so I am a lifelong educator. This question is always a loaded one because it's like, what do I begin with? Like, what's the most salient thing that I think folks should know about me? And I think the first thing that comes to mind is that I am a mother to two young children. And the work that I do as an educational consultant is very much so keeping in mind how are we creating schools and school systems that are going to allow not only my children, but their peers and other young children within the system to have equitable educational opportunities and outcomes. And so my work as primarily a literacy consultant and one of the founders of Equity Consulting Group centers on supporting schools and school leaders with thinking about the ways in which we can offer intentional professional learning and professional development to educators in order to support all of their students in front of them and meet them where they are based on their readiness.
All right, love it, love it, love it. Welcome to the show. Jacoby, why don't you share a little bit about yourself and what you currently do?
Yeah, so happy to be here. So I wear many hats right now. One of the main hats I wear is network director for a grant-funded project of middle school, literacy middle school, where we enact PLCs. We come alongside the school to do deep professional learning communities. I also do consulting as well through Equity Consulting Group.
So I like to hear the origin story about how the two of you got together. So Jacoby, why don't you share, how did the two of you connect? And I guess what was the motivation behind the book?
Ooh, great question. So Reshma and I originally connected as teachers in a charter school network we were both teaching at. She was at the school across town on the east side. I was in the school on the west side. And as two brown people navigating the charter school world, we connected, and then we ended up both at the same consulting company a couple years later, and we reconnected. And that's when our friendship and our journey together really began. Some of the motivation for this book comes from our years of being a number of schools across the city and seeing works like Teach Like a Champion and others come out that were very like cookie cutter, excuse me, y'all, about what does engagement look like? How do you manage a class, et cetera, et cetera. And I saw many new educators entering the field, their first year, second year, third year teaching, and not making connections to their students, even though they were doing all the things that Teach for a Champion was saying. And so I had many coaching conversations being like, well, who are you? How do you bring that into the classroom? So yeah, the strategies are the strategies, but you can't pair them without your authentic self. And that birthed the idea of reclaiming authenticity, and how do we bring authenticity back into the profession in ways that are humanizing to both the teacher and the student.
Okay. Go ahead,
And I have one
Resmaa.
thing. I love when Jacoby tells a story because it's always nice to like hear the origin of this experience and like our friendship. She's my sister friend, and I want to add that our work as coaches and instructional consultants really allowed us to step back and think about our own beliefs and like use our own learning experiences to inform the ways in which we're approaching teachers and empathizing where they might be in their headspace around how they're viewing teaching and pedagogy and learning. So I think, when it comes to instructional coaching work, very often there's this sentiment of like, oh, the consultant is the end all be all, or they know everything. But I think there was a tandem learning that happened in our work. And Jacoby, I don't know, maybe I'm speaking for myself here only, feel free to jump in and tell me from but I think like that's like in writing the book together, that's one thing that really came to top of mind for me, for sure.
Jacoby, you agree? You're good with all?
Yeah, good.
Okay, I just want to make sure. Here's the thing, and some of the things that kind of stood out to me, even in the title of your book, is the authenticity piece of this. And I'm just curious because you mentioned Jacoby, as far as sometimes there's curriculum or strategies that we're giving, and they may come across as a one size fits all, or it might mean that a teacher or a staff member may not be their true self. I'm just kind of curious, Jacoby, what do you give us a little bit more as far as what you mean by the authenticity piece of things?
Yeah, our identity and who we are is made up of many different complex things, right? Gender, religion, where you were born, race, lived experiences, the type of schooling you had, socioeconomic, whatever. And when thinking about our identity that encompasses these things, and even like the things we like to do, like I love to dance, etc. And then coupled with the school, professional environment, but one where relationships undergird the teaching and the work. And so thinking about what are the things about you as an educator that you can bring authentically to the space to connect with your students and make your teaching jazzy. So for example, I worked with an 8th grade middle school teacher, and they had recently changed to a new curriculum, and she had all the things. She had like the explicit instruction, the group work, etc. Yet kids weren't really like engaging in the work, and they loved her as a teacher. And so in one of our coaching conversations, I asked her more about herself. What do you like to read? What do you do for fun, etc.? And she mentioned that she loves the Harry Potter series. And I was like, well, how can we bring that into the work? And she's like, oh, well, she likes the different personalities that they have. And so I was like, okay. So as you're teaching her a lesson, how can you bring that energy of the Hermione? I sadly have not read the book, y'all. So I'm
Hermione.
probably
Hermione.
Yeah, I'm sorry, I've never seen one either.
Love Harry Potter, but have problems with J.K. Rowling. So I understand. I get it.
So it's like, how do we bring in that excitement surrounding that character? Even though you may not be teaching that book, but what is it about you that is exciting? And for her, it was like the nerdiness and the, like, she's like, she best represents me. And I'm like, okay, well, what does that look like? And so where she landed was that she wanted to use her relationships with students to move the lesson along, but she wanted to do it in a more engaging way in terms of like changing her intonation to be more dramatic. Because, she was a theater kid as well, right? But she had never made that connection between like theater kid. It's okay to bring some of that drama, that excitement to the classroom and merit with your pedagogy, your teaching.
Gotcha. Okay. Thank you for explaining that. And I think it's interesting that when we talk about being authentic, sometimes we do feel like we can't be ourselves. And I talk about in some of the work that I do as far as like students feel like they had to assimilate to a school's culture and community. But you're bringing up a really good point. A lot of our staff members, a lot of our teachers aren't able to do so or feel like they aren't able to do so. So I'm thankful that you were able to kind of coach us like, no, bring the Harry Potter in here and teach them, because that's a really good way to connect. This kind of leads me to some pieces that I really want to talk about in regards to your book. Resmaa, I want to ask you this in regards to the unintentional things that we do, right? So to me, that's one example, right? Like I didn't know I could be my true self by bringing in Harry Potter. So again, we assume best intentions, but what are some of the unintentional practices that might be harmful that we see in our classrooms?
Yeah. So I think of the unintentional low rigor and expectations that we might put forth in some of the assignments that we give our students because of perceptions that we have about their readiness to do certain things. And so, an example from this school year to think about, New York City is rolling out the New York City Reads initiative, where there are high quality instructional materials that are being put forth in front of students by teachers. These materials were designed by big box publishers, and there are a host of tensions and tension points around that. However, some of the texts are at grade level and above grade level. And when you have teachers who sometimes see this content and have unconsciously formed a narrative around a student's readiness and abilities, not because they don't like that student, not because they're intentionally doing so, there's a tension point that shows up around, I'm going to give the student this text to read, but I don't think they actually can do it. And so because I don't think they can actually do it, I'm not giving them the scaffolds and the structures to grapple with it in a way that will show me that they can actually do it. But the way in which they're learning is going to just look a little different than what the box curriculum is telling me it's supposed to look like. I think that's one major academic example that we see across the board, across the nation. I think in school communities and contexts where you have children who represent the global majority, right? There are more brown and Black children in those spaces. Teachers, based on their own lived experiences, come into those spaces with perceptions, assumptions, wonderings that are unconsciously seated in their minds about those students and what they have the capacity to do. I know that as a nation right now, we're in a space where you can't talk about race, you can't talk about equity, you can't talk about all the things, and we still need to have those conversations, right? Like there are mandates in federal, but people, we have adults who are in front of children who have not spent enough time necessarily, not all adults, right? Not all teachers, but some adults and some teachers, particularly in spaces where you have a lot of brown and Black children, are coming in not having sat with their own lived experiences long enough to think about how are the things that I'm saying and doing impacting my students and reflective of how I actually feel about them and the harm that I'm unconsciously committing.
So what I'm hearing is, again, unintentional, but like maybe not, or assuming that students aren't able to do some of the work, and so they quote unquote dumb it down because that's what they can do. And you're saying that you challenge those things. Is that correct?
Definitely. I think, in instances where teachers say that students cannot, my first question to them is, well, how do you know? What's the evidence and data to tell you? Oh, well, their iReady score says X, Y, and Z. Yes, their iReady scores say X, Y, and Z. And what is the student showing you when you put a similar task in front of them in that moment? Does it match the iReady scores? Because iReady is a tool where they can just click through and like show you something else, right? Like the
Right.
data is not always accurate.
But the argument can be made, oh, I'm a ninth grade ELA teacher, and the scores say that they're reading at a third grade level, so they cannot read at ninth grade. How do we respond in those type of situations?
It's a opportunity gap not to expose kids to grade level text. You're not giving them the opportunity, right, to do so. So what I always like to tell high school literacy teachers, because that inevitably comes up everywhere, right, is, well, what are the access points so kids can access the text? So that might look like pre-annotating some of the important things you want kids to pay attention to. It might look like streamlining the text, and rather than it being, 10 pages, maybe certain groups are reading 4 pages where it has the main ideas that you want kids to take away from it. And it's still at grade level, but maybe just not as long. Or maybe you want to define key vocab in the margin, et cetera, et cetera. But my question is always how can we think together to provide access? Sometimes that means audio. There's so many books on YouTube these days. And usually once we try it works. I will say sometimes it's not smooth going from the first time you try it, right? Because it's you try the one thing and you're like, okay, that worked for some of my students, but then my English language learners, they still didn't access it, right? And then so you got to now think towards that. So my biggest thing is if we don't give kids the opportunity and give them access points to the opportunity, then it's an equity issue.
All right. So if we don't let them try, at least, like you said, I think it's Resmaa said, how do you know whether or not they can do it or not? Then if we don't give them those opportunities, then we'll never see. And then again, that ultimately is not going to be the most successful thing for our students. Are there any other unintentional practices out there that sometimes that we do?
So one thing that comes to mind, and it comes to mind because of a class visit that I did last week. And I noticed when thinking about language that this classroom, they had been working on explicit instruction and making it more transferable to students in their group time and independent work. And the lesson was explicit, it was good. And then I was looking around at students, those towards the front were on it and engaged cognitively. And then those sitting towards the back happened to be language learners who are on iPads working through an online program. And in that moment, I was oh, I 100% understand why the educator did this, right? As someone who I don't really speak other languages, I pretend to speak Spanish sometimes, but I understand, right? Because as a newer educator, I did the same thing because it can be overwhelming to try to figure out how to meet the needs of all your students. And in that moment, though, I started to realize like this is like a linguistic injustice, right? Of again, it's like, how do we meet the needs of our language learners and include them in the learning that the class does, right? By drawing them to the side. And I'm not saying like a mixture of things won't work, because they can work, but thinking about what languages are we prioritizing in our classrooms, and if that's English, great, it's English class. And how do we make bridges to other students' cultures or languages in ways that can include them and make them feel a part of the community versus making them feel isolated. And I think that's really where like how we think about authenticity comes in, because in the book we talk about authenticity being good for both teachers and their humanity and also students, right? Because as teachers, it also doesn't feel good when your kids aren't where you want them to be, or maybe your class doesn't run how you want it to. We've all been there and had those days. And when thinking about authenticity, it's like, okay, I have these language learners. How do I not do them harm? And how do I think about like who I am, my identity, and what connections can I make? So maybe it's through an experience that you both shared. Maybe it's through you learning a different language and you're telling story. Maybe it's through translanguaging and allowing all kids, even yourself, to use words that may not be standard English, right? Yeah. So that's the first thing that comes to mind.
Okay.
Can I give a little plug if possible? So, two things. Jacoby is an amazing salsa dancer. So, I know she jokingly said that she dabbles in salsa dancing in Spanish. And then the other is that we actually have a webinar from last October where Jacoby explores the idea of linguistic justice within classrooms, particularly as it pertains to New York City Reads. And I want to also echo what Jacoby just named of like authenticity, not just being good for adults, because if adults are feeling seen and heard and who they are as educators, it's going to translate into them creating a classroom space and cultivating a classroom environment where they're more willing to let down their guard when it comes to building authentic relationships and intentional relationships with kids that'll allow them to know more about them as human beings, and then provide the instructional support based on what they are learning about them as people and young people.
I like this conversation because, sometimes I feel like you're giving permission to be your true self. I think sometimes we'll say stuff like, oh, you need to be culture responsive. And so, take account to who's in your classroom and look at the demographics and be mindful of those things. What does that look like? What kind of examples? How can the students relate to the content that you're delivering and make sure that it comes alive? But some of the stuff that I'm hearing within today's conversation is, if we look at the statistics, right? We know our teaching staff is predominantly white. However, our student population is predominantly of color. So in some ways, when we're saying we need to be culture responsive, that might mean that some of our teachers aren't, their personal beliefs and like you said, the Harry Potters or whatever stuff they may be interested in may not be reflected within their classroom spaces. So for those who might be saying, oh, okay, this authentic piece is not culture responsive, or those who might want to push back in some of these conversations because, oh, you're bringing in your authentic self, but then that's not going to connect with your students. What kind of responses can we give to individuals that may have that kind of pushback towards the authentic part?
It's an interesting question because I don't see it as separate from, I see them as like kind of merging, right? Like part of being culturally responsive is being culturally competent, not just in one student's culture, but like across. And that could even be like social, politically competent as well. And when I think about being authentic, it's like bringing your humanity in the classroom, allowing students' humanity to shine in the classroom. And in a conversation with the educator, I would encourage them to do empathy interviews. I would encourage them to come up with like 4 or 5 questions to ask a range of their students in a one-on-one conversation or even in a small group, thinking about whatever subject matter the teacher teaches. For example, like, tell me 2 things you like about your English class. Or if you could change one thing, what would it be? What has been your favorite activity we've done in class so far? Or et cetera, et cetera. And sometimes you'll be shocked what kids share. And then it's like, okay, how did you take what you learned from your kids? And how do you take what your kids are telling you that they need or want from you? And then how do you marry that with what you know about the curriculum, your style, and who you are? And it's like a synergy between all three of them versus just one piece. So I don't really see them as being separate, but I see them lending towards each other. And in the book, we actually talk about culturally responsive. I can't remember what chapter it is, but we talk about it and we use that in a way that like undergirds our framework as well.
Resmaa saying chapter 2.
We definitely talk about it in chapter 2. And I want to read this quote from chapter 5, which actually talks about trying not to do harm, which explores the gist of the chapters that explores the ways in which anti-Blackness has lived in our schooling system and the implications for how teachers and students are impacted. And this quote from page 124 says, "Intentional activism is necessary to bring about change in schools and to heal the legacy of schools being a site of struggle and harm, to collectively heal across our intersectional identities as both teachers and students and move toward humanizing schools and learning spaces, we must create cultural shifts." This activism work is not easy, but it is necessary for you to be an authentic teacher who is in touch with your inner self, history, and culture in service of not causing harm or being detrimental to yourself and your students.
Come through, Reshma, with the quote. That quote like summed it up much better than I just like talked.
No, the add-on. It was like the icing. You built the cake.
I love that. See, y'all are a great partnership. So just the two of you, just watching the two of you go back and forth has been fun. One of the things I talk to some of my teachers and they'll tell me stuff like, "Oh, well, I'm not a person of color, so I don't have culture, and now I'm just whatever. I'm just me." And what are some suggestions do you have out there in regards to kind of recognizing that identity and kind of just pulling from who you are and displaying that authenticity? So for those, because again, I have these conversations where people say, "Oh, I'm not a person of color, so I don't have any culture." What kind of suggestions do you have for those type of answers, Jacobē?
One of my favorite activities that kind of provides the baseline for that conversation is the onion activity, where you have like an onion and the outside of the onion is like what people see when they look at you. But then as you go go deeper into the onion, then it's like the things people don't see.
Right.
And we usually give folks like a list of kind of guiding questions that help them go deeper beyond like religion or race, but like go deeper really in terms of who they are. And then once we have those conversations, it's so interesting because then educators, when sharing their onions with each other, make connections to their beliefs or their values as well, based upon kind of their lived experiences and who they are. And so I would say like everywhere we go has a culture, right? How we do home has culture. Like how you do home in your house may look very different than how I do home in my house, or different expectations, values, communication styles. So wherever we go, there's culture. There's culture in schools, right? Like if you go to some schools that are higher socioeconomic status, you'll see the school culture may look a lot different than kids in other neighborhoods. And so it's like we all have culture, and culture is not static. And culture just doesn't pertain to race, which a lot of people think it does. It's much broader than race.
Peel back those layers. All right. Well, I will tell you this, between the two of you, I have learned a lot and I can't wait to dig into the book even further. Folks, of course, the link is in the show notes. I want you to take us home with any final words of advice that you want to provide to our listeners out there.
Thank you for that. I just want to name a couple of things. I think we, as a society, as a nation, if you're in the United States, we're at an inflection point when it comes to education and teachers. For many years, there has been this narrative that all things that are wrong with schools are at the feet of teachers. And our book was designed to be an opportunity for teachers to say, "No, I'm doing the best that I can, and here is how I can do better and be a better educator and be the type of educator that I truly want to be. In our design and writing of this book, we really wanted to give teachers, teams, school leaders resources, structures, materials to get them to think about the ways in which we can disrupt what schooling has looked like for the past 50 plus years, because there's something about it that's just not working. It's not working for the kids. It's not working for the educators. Educators are not happy. So how do we try and do differently? One of the beautiful things, one of the many beautiful things about this book, I think, comes from Jacoby's experience of writing her dissertation in tandem to writing the book, where so many of the beautiful ideas of her dissertation work landed in thinking about what would the future of education look like? How do we center joy in our schools and classroom communities? And so my hope for folks who pick up the book and are engaging in it is that you walk away feeling empowered in your capacity and brilliance as an educator, and know that we're here right alongside you doing this good work for the sake of our children.
Cosign.
Okay. Well, thank you, Resmaa. Jacobē, I'd love to get your final thoughts as well.
Yes, I like how Reshma mentioned this moment of time of where we are in a nation as the US. And I think one of the things that comes out so clearly for me in this book is this idea of humanity, right? At the core of who we are, at the core of who our students are, like we just want to belong, right? We want to be loved, et cetera, right? And so it's like, how do we reflect and how can we use introspection? And we've quite a bit of reflection throughout the book. And how do we do that reflection and put it in conversation with what our kids are telling us that we need? So how do we hold our own humanity with students' humanity and kind of pave a way forward that's different from how we currently operate?
Love it. It's cosign, right? Okay. All right. Resmaa, if we have some folks that want to connect with you, what's the best way to reach you online?
Yeah, so Jacobē and I both have LinkedIn accounts. You can also contact us at our emails. Mine is reshma@equityconsulting.org. I'm also on Instagram and Twitter. My Instagram handle is Risha0927. Twitter is Dr. RRA. Jacobē?
Yeah, LinkedIn is the best way to contact me. Email would be second best, MissJacobēBell@gmail. And I'm also on Instagram, but LinkedIn is probably the best way.
All right. Once again, I am speaking to Jacobē Bell and Reshma Ramkellawan, authors of Reclaiming Authenticity, Unearth Your True Self, and Build an Equitable Classroom, folks. Links in the show notes. Jacobē, Resmaa, it has truly been a pleasure. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you.
Thank you.
It's likewise. Thank you.